So I think we will start. I hope you can all hear me. Good, great. So welcome everyone to this webinar on women leadership, chemical safety and SDGs. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. This webinar is co-organized by the SAICM Secretariat, UNEP and the International Pollutants Elimination Network, also known as IPEN. The webinar aims to draw attention to the intersection between gender and chemicals management, its vital importance for reaching the 2030 SDGs, and to highlight the recent contributions by UNEP and IPEN in this regard. As a background information, in 2021, a joint UNEP and IPEN report was launched, namely entitled Women, Chemicals and the SDGs. And this was an output of the currently ongoing SAICM GEF project on global best practices on emerging policy issues of concern under SAICM. The report focuses on the SAICM emerging policy issues and identifies gender priorities. Building on this report and advancing chemical safety, IPEN has developed a series of free online courses on women and chemicals to enhance the role of women and women's leadership in local, regional, national, and global efforts to reduce exposures to harmful chemicals and waste. As for the discussion, we will be welcoming this evening for me and different time zones that we are on. Mr. Per Ängquist from the Swedish Chemical Agency, and I hope I said your name correctly, Mr. Ängquist.
Super fine.
Perfect. So he will be giving us a keynote speech to kick us off. We will then be followed, this will then be followed by 4 short interventions from our distinguished panelists, who will give a short overview of their work and how it relates to the issue of gender, chemicals and waste and SDGs. And then finally, we'll conclude this webinar with a discussion and questions and answer sessions for the invited panelists. And I see already we have 95 participants on this call, which is fantastic. So looking forward to an interactive session today. So just maybe some very short housekeeping announcements. So please note that the session is being recorded, and the recording and a transcript and saved chat will be made available to all participants following this webinar. Please remain, put yourself on mute and with your cameras off throughout the discussion. And we will be using the chat function for us to communicate. And if you have any questions, any thoughts, comments, please drop it off in the chat box, and then we will try and address them during the course of this webinar. These questions will then be channeled to the different panelists as well, depending on the type of question that is being asked. We're very pleased to note that this session has got simultaneous interpretation in English, French, and Spanish. And as you had seen in the video that we just saw earlier, there is a place in your at the bottom of your screen where you can choose the language that you would like to use. If you do have any problems with the interpretation, please let us know in the chat. And finally, a summary report of the discussion as well as the presenters' PowerPoint slides will be made available to all the participants following this webinar. So let's kick off the session. We welcome Per to this webinar. Thank you very much for making yourself available. Per is the Director General at the Swedish Chemicals Agency, and I have the pleasure to give you the floor. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this webinar. I will, based on my experiences, give some reflections on the interlinkages between gender and chemicals. The complexities when aiming to draw attention to the issues of chemicals and gender are twofold. When chemicals are discussed, it is often considered too technical. And to attract a broader audience when discussing gender, we often have a special challenge reaching out to men. So saying that, I welcome all participants to this webinar, hoping there is a fair representation of both men and women, because we all need to care about both chemical safety and gender equality. I think gender equality is an enabler and accelerator for achieving most, not to say all, the Sustainable Development Goals. And as such, it needs to be recognized for its opportunities and become central to the priorities of countries in policies, in decisions, and of course also in allocation of resources. And relating to achieving most aspects of the Agenda 2030 is also chemicals and waste management. And implementation of preventive chemicals control provides practical solutions and opportunities in contributing to reaching the SDGs. This webinar and the UNEP IPEN report on women, chemicals, and the SDGs comes timely as an input to the work on achieving the SDGs and on the ongoing process to establish new global goals for realizing the vision of no harm from the use of chemicals. As stated in the report, all people, irrespective of gender identity, must have the same rights, the same responsibilities, and also the same opportunities in the sound management of chemicals and waste. In the SDGs and in Agenda 2030, securing opportunities for women to play a representative and influential role in shaping sustainable development is of highest priority. And with the aim to contribute to gender equality globally and the full enjoyment of human rights by all, my country, Sweden, since 2014, pursue a feminist foreign policy. And this policy is an agenda for change to strengthen the rights, representation, and resources of all women and girls. Gender equality work is ultimately a matter of redistributing power and resources that in turn will deliver benefits to all, to women, of course, but also to us men. My agency has, over the last 10 years, been working to implement an action plan for a non-toxic everyday environment. And it is focused on protecting children and young people in everyday life. And this focus has been successful in gaining interest in the society to the importance of chemical safety and that it provides benefits to all, including the environment. And with a focus on the protection of children from chemical hazards, support in taking actions is generally gained and will protect also, of course, the population at large. Both women and men need information to make informed decisions. And information on chemicals in products is of high priority and an issue where a lot of international awareness has been achieved through being one of the emerging policy issues within SAICM since 2009. And for chemicals as such, we have a harmonized labeling system, the GHS, to inform both occupational and private users of the hazards. But for everyday articles, information on the chemical content is much scarcer. And to promote informed decision-making as a consumer, it is important that information can be found in a form that is easily accessible for most of us. My experience is that women are more often than men, actually, front runners in a shift towards sustainable consumption and production. A Swedish study on behavioral patterns in consumption of textiles, as an example, showed that women were more willing to change their behavior towards buying less new clothes, buying more secondhand, borrowing instead of buying, taking better care of their clothes, mending them, etc. And there are also some studies showing that female investors tend to take decisions that to a higher degree take sustainability into consideration than male investors do. So the representation of women in decision-making is important for improved chemical safety. Women, men, boys, girls, we are all exposed to harmful chemicals. However, in different ways and to the varying degrees depending on social structures and where we live and work. Men still dominate the exposure during paid work. For example, the chemicals and mining sectors. While women, on the other hand, often are disproportionately exposed in non-paid activities. For example, to chemicals in products for cleaning, personal care, and pest control. I think in the formulation of new global goals and new indicators for chemicals and waste management, I think we need to ensure and make best use of gender-divided statistics to follow and examine further these differences. As mentioned in the UNEP IPEN report, men and women are also sometimes differently impacted by effects of chemicals. This is apparent for a range of substances. For instance, when it comes to some chemicals that can affect the endocrine system. Women are more vulnerable to some substances, and men are more vulnerable to others. For example, male fertility is more sensitive to exposure to phthalates, while the high risks to fetuses of lead implies that women in fertile age are to avoid all lead exposure. But excluding women or excluding men from certain occupations due to different impacts is not the solution we want. Or to have dietary restrictions specifically for women to protect fetuses from exposure should not be the long-term solution we aim for. We must strive towards solutions where both men and women can enjoy the same freedom, have the same work opportunities and possibilities to work safely. And personally, I also think it is time to somewhat re-examine the societal norms on who is supposed to take responsibility with regard to reproductive health, including dietary recommendations, since this is relevant for all in fertile age, women and men. And I also dare to say that reproduction is not a female issue. Neither is it a male issue. It is a human issue, dependent on both men and women. And both men and women need to care about it. To summarize, there are many opportunities within preventive chemicals control and in gender equality in contributing to the overall achievements of the SDGs. Both matters equally to women and men, and both women and men must play an active role to make the wanted change for all of us. Thank you, and once again, welcome to this webinar.
Oh, thank you very much, Per, for really those very interesting sharing of information from from the Swedish side of things, referencing, the fact that today we have with us, as you had seen in and Health branch of UNEP, we have Pamela Miller, who is the co-chair of IPEN, Vivian Atta, who is from the Center of Research and Education for Development, and Cecilia Bianco and Ariana Ortega. And I want to get this correct. I want to say the right word, from Tala Ecologista. Is that correct? Great. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for accepting our invitation to participate in this panel. We're really looking forward to hearing from you. And so we'll kickstart with our panel members with Monika Mcdevitt. So Monika, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Nalini. And let me just do the technical thing here and share my presentation. All right. I hope everybody can see my presentation now. First, let me start off by thanking everyone, particularly the participants, for joining in today.
Monika, would you like to put it in the slide mode?
Oh, isn't it in? It's in slide mode on. Okay, hang on.
No.
Press that little button down there. Is that better?
That's perfect. Thank you very much.
Okay, sorry about that. But yes, no, thank you to all the participants for clicking in and connecting in on this really important presentation, and also on the entire webinar. Also, the IPEN colleagues and the SAICM Secretariat colleagues for an excellent report that they produced. And I do appreciate the comments that have just been made by Per. And I think he makes some very good points that I'll also allude to over the course of my presentation. Okay, what I'd like to do in this very short presentation is just give you a few glimpses of some of the work that UNEP, the UN Environment Program, has been doing over the years on gender, environment, and also specifically on chemicals and waste. So let me just sort of give you a little bit of a flashback. The issue of gender in the environment has often been viewed in a fragmented manner. UNEP and UN Women, with gender experts from around the world, took an integrated and holistic assessment approach of the environment from a gendered lens. This was called for in 2014 by the Network of Women Ministers and Leaders for the Environment, and the report, the title of which you see on the slide here, was presented and launched at the UN Environment Assembly in May 2016. So while this might seem a little outdated now in 2022, in reality, the fundamental conclusions of that report resonate today as we discuss issues of gender in the context of the sound management of chemicals and waste, and how this can advance achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. I'd like to point out a few salient conclusions of the 2016 GGEO in order to make these links in my presentation. The report's findings concluded with these. Gender and environmental factors need to be taken in the context of local, national, even regional situations and priorities. In the absence of gender disaggregated information, data, indicators, and other information, environmental analyses will be inadequate and partial and hamper our understanding and ultimately our achievement of sustainability goals. Unsustainable development activities have negative impacts on the environment. They create unequal pressures and health consequences for women, men, boys, and girls, and vulnerable groups in both developing and developed countries. So enabling conditions for large-scale transformations with respect to the environment and gender need to be created. And I think Per highlighted that very nicely. So thank you for that, Per. And finally, we cannot forget that gender is not just about women. From a societal, economic, and environmental perspective, all voices are essential for creating sustainable futures. This slide just gives you a little bit of a snapshot of some of the mandates that UNEP has in terms of working specifically on gender and environment, and increasingly on the environment and health nexus with respect to gender issues. So we do have resolutions and we do have calls from government to work particularly in these areas. And I'm not going to go through and read all of that. You can read it on these slides yourselves. They do tend to be fairly parliamentary language type, but essentially it's to increasingly promote gender equality and a human rights perspective in the empowerment of women and girls in environmental governance, for example. So I'd like to go to some of the key findings of the Gender, Chemicals, and SDGs report that we are discussing today, and note that it echoes and reinforces several of the key findings and conclusions of that 2016 Global Gender and Environment Outlook. Rights, responsibilities, and opportunities to achieve the SDGs. Social context must be taken into consideration when understanding the effects and impacts of chemicals and environmental pollution on gender. Gender disaggregated data must be generated and used. Women are disproportionately affected, have less access to participation, yet are key agents of change. So we know this from many studies, not only from the UN studies, but we know this through history, and they still resonate and raise up again in all of the studies that we seem to end up doing. UNEP does continue to be active on issues of environment and gender, including through work in the chemicals area. So I'll spend the rest of my time providing you with some highlights of our recent work in this area, but I hope that that's given you a little bit of a background and sort of connecting some of the work from the environment and also to the chemicals and waste. UNEP has been working with partners in Bhutan, Mongolia, and Nepal, and has collected some really inspiring stories of women taking a leadership role in their communities. Empowering women is one of the central themes of our work on the environmental front, including for the sound management of chemicals and waste. So here on this side, you can just see, some glimpses from those reports in the countries of Bhutan, Mongolia, and Nepal. And these reports are available on the UNEP website, and we can put them into the chat box at a later time so that you can access them directly. But I think what's also really important is that much of the work that we do at the global level, such as the Global Gender and Environment Outlook and other reports, has that link to the importance of internalizing and learning from what goes on the ground with countries. We also learn from country experience working upward to inform a better and more, I think, applicable and practical global framework for including and mainstreaming gender into a lot of environmental work, including on chemicals and waste management. So with some of these examples, and you can see the title pages here, these are country projects that once again very clearly demonstrate the persistent gap in credible data to aid in the understanding and the gendered basis of chemicals in the environment. So you can see that some of the conclusions that are coming out of these reports are very consistent with most of what we find, and perhaps it's a little frustrating in a way, because we know that there are data gaps, that we need to look at disaggregated data, yet it's a long time coming, and it seems to not be the easiest thing to embed in processes at either local, national, even regional, or a global basis. But we mustn't stop pushing for it. Through our offices in Osaka, Japan, for example, we're focusing on gendered aspects of chemicals and waste due to the pandemic, highlighting once again the inequality of the effects of unsound management of chemicals and waste on women. An interesting and important outcome of much of this pandemic gender-related work is that of just transitions, ensuring inclusive, gender-responsive policy responses, such as integrated and targeted measures in COVID recovery processes, as well as the importance of having inclusive and effective policies and measures that need to be grounded in reliable evidence and data. So there's some really topical and very specific work on how we look at chemicals and waste management from a pandemic perspective, which sadly we're all still currently immersed in. Moving to the report itself, we looked at a number of the emerging policy issues that Nalini mentioned in her opening remarks. And we note that all 8 of the identified emerging policy issues adopted today were identified to have an impact on human health, specifically noting impacts on vulnerable groups such as women and children. The sessions of the International Conference on Chemicals Management, or ICCM, were held in 2009, 2012, 2015, with more than 120 governments represented at each meeting, ensuring a broad buy-in for these adopted issues, and you can see them here on the screen. The IPEN report once again highlights a critical gap. The criteria for identifying these EPIs takes toxicological and exposure data gaps into account. The exposure data from most developing countries and countries in transition is scarce, and that sex and gender disaggregated data is largely missing for most of the emerging policy issues. So this is a very important point to hone in on and to reinforce in terms of the policy context. The report also provides clear examples of the link between achieving the SDGs and the connections with these 8 emerging policy issues, and concludes in highlighting the importance of women's equal participation in chemicals management, as well as the need to prioritize the protection of women as a group highly susceptible to adverse effects from chemical exposure. So what you see here on the screen here is essentially the SDG 5 on gender equality and its interpretation in terms of gender bias and the fact that it really is undermining our social fabric, and to fail to recognize that devalues all of our efforts. And that gender is not just, as I think Per also pointed out, a women's or a gender issue, but it's also a human rights issue. The Women in Chemicals and SDGs report has a very nice quote there, and I've left it up there for you to sort of take a look at and internalize as we move on in this panel. The other aspect that I want to bring to your attention is work elsewhere in UNEP, and not just on the chemicals and waste branch, which I represent, but also taking it back to UNEP, being a custodian for several of the SDG targets and indicators. And as such, very recently, just in 2021, UNEP produced this report that you see on the screen here with the aim to provide a coherent methodology for measuring the SDG indicators related to municipal and food waste, hazardous waste, and the recycling rate. And so you'll see up there that there's a nice quotation that I managed to pull out of the report, and I would really strongly recommend that you look for this report on the UNEP website, because it's full of really important methodology to help advance getting to that opportunity for gender-related data and the SDGs. This report aims to strengthen the knowledge base of chemicals and hazardous waste and enhance the capacity of countries to track progress toward related SDGs and their indicators across different sectors in order to strengthen the evidence base for policymaking and stakeholder action, including taking into consideration gender. For SDG Target 12.4, which reads, by 2020, achieve the environmentally sound management of chemicals and all waste throughout their life cycle, in accordance with the agreed international frameworks, and significantly reduce their release into air, water, and soil in order to minimize their adverse impacts on human health and the environment. This particular report, plus the work that is being done through not only this branch, but the IPEN and UNEP SAICM report, and a lot of other work, this target is something that we are really quite focused on in terms of making sure that we bring a gendered lens to the work. So with that, I would like to conclude my presentation, and I hope that this gives you a brief overview of some of the areas of work that UNEP has and continues to undertake on the environmental dimension of gender, chemicals, and waste, and particularly in partnership and appreciation with IPEN on this really important work. So thank you for your kind attention, and I look forward to any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Monika. I think also very inspiring about all of the activities and interventions that UNEP has been doing in this field. And I really liked your point about, that not only using a top-down method, but also a bottom-up method to adapt information so that we can learn from different experiences from national and local levels, bring it to global levels, and then the global level policy setting, but being adapted to the local needs. So that was really interesting. So without further ado, then let me pass the floor on to Pamela. So Pamela, you have the floor. Pamela, as I mentioned earlier, is the co-chair for IPEN.
Thank you so much, Nalini. And it really is an honor to be a part of this panel and this event. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all my colleagues and friends around the world who are joining today. I will share my screen. In addition to being the IPEN co-chair, I also have the privilege of serving as executive director of an NGO based in the US, in Alaska and Arctic, called Alaska Community Action on Toxics. And so I'll be speaking really from both perspectives today, some of the on-the-ground work that we're doing to build women's leadership and do community-based research, and also the work that we're doing with IPEN. And most of you know, I think that IPEN is a global network of over 600 public interest NGOs in more than 120 countries working together for a toxics-free future. And there's amazing work on the ground happening for environmental health and human rights, with a collective effort toward achieving protective international chemicals policy and waste policies that help protect the health of everyone. We're very grateful to have developed a partnership with UNEP to contribute to the work on gender and chemicals through a focus on women. And I'm really excited about this webinar. A couple of resources that I'd like to note, mentioned by Nalini and also Monika, this report on women, chemicals, and the SDGs. I would like to acknowledge the primary author, Sarah Brochet, the IPEN Science Advisor. And also here is the link to really the incredible new educational series of online courses, also referred to by Nalini, that focuses on the specific risks that women face when exposed to toxic chemicals. And you'll be hearing from some of the remarkable women leaders who have created some of these courses in just a few minutes. And I'd also like to mention that we, IPEN, have a gender caucus chaired by Olga Speranskaya and also myself that includes regular webinars and a gender listserv. So please let us know if you'd be interested to join this. This is just a little bit about Alaska Community Action on Toxics. We're an environmental justice and health organization that works primarily with Indigenous communities in Alaska. We do community-based research. We do policy and advocacy, leadership training. We work on policy at a local to international level, recognizing that chemicals don't have political boundaries. And just a short note about my own origin story. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the place where I come from and also my ancestors in this work. And I came from a small town in Dover, Ohio in the US. It's along the Tuscarawas River. It also turns out, and it's beautiful country, mostly agricultural, but it's also home to Dover Chemical Corporation, which is the largest manufacturer of chlorinated paraffins in the world. It is now a Superfund site, also known as one of the most polluted sites in the country in the US. And I wanted to say something about my mother here very briefly. She was a nurse and a healer in our neighborhood, and she really inspired my work, both as a biologist and an activist today. She began witnessing really the health disparities in the cancer cluster in this community caused by this chemical corporation. And that's really the primary reason that I'm doing this work today. I'd also like to acknowledge one of the women leaders that has inspired the work here in Alaska. This is Annie Aloa. She was a community health worker in her community of Savunga on St. Lawrence Island, known by the traditional name of Sivukak. And she too began witnessing the patterns of health disparities associated with military contamination on St. Lawrence Island. St. Lawrence Island was home to a huge military base that operated from the 1950s through the 1970s, and they left a legacy of hazardous waste, including large quantities of PCBs in unlined landfills, pesticides, solvents, as well as heavy metals. And Annie was the one that alerted us and helped to form Alaska Community Action on Toxics. And this is how we began our community-based research to understand the long-term environmental and health effects of this military contamination, as well as persistent organic pollutants that have arrived on wind and ocean currents in the Arctic. And this is the place that we work in the Arctic, where the Arctic is really at the forefront of both climate change and the global transport of chemicals that arrive sometimes hundreds and thousands of miles away on wind and ocean currents and accumulate in the bodies of fish, wildlife, and people. And people, and especially indigenous peoples of the North and of the Arctic, are especially vulnerable because of their close reliance on fish, marine mammals as part of their diet. And we know that Arctic indigenous peoples have some of the highest levels of these chemicals of any population on Earth. And I'll be talking a little bit about how studies on women and concentrations of chemicals in breast milk help inspire the work toward the negotiation of the Stockholm Convention. This was a very small study of breast milk in 5 countries, and you can see the second bar shows levels of, these are polybrominated diphenyl ethers, which are flame retardant chemicals used in a variety of household products, furniture, and electronics. And the woman who participated in the study from Alaska had the highest levels. And this is really a trend that we see with many persistent organic pollutants, that women's breast milk is the concentrator of chemicals that move into this region from all over the hemisphere. It's a hemispheric sink. And I mentioned it was a study that was done by scientists in Canada that found that levels of persistent organic pollutants, including PCBs, were at 5 times the levels of these chemicals in breast milk of women in lower latitudes of Canada. So Inuit women of the far north had some of the highest levels of these chemicals. And this is really what prompted the nations of the world to come together to negotiate what was to become the Stockholm Convention. And it was this study that led to the aim of the global community to eliminate the world's most dangerous chemicals. And there are now 30 chemicals listed under the Stockholm Convention and additional substances that are under evaluation. And I just wanted to note really quickly here that the preamble of the convention acknowledges the particular vulnerability of women, children, and indigenous communities of the Arctic. And in the lower right-hand corner, you see an Inuit statue of a woman and child that was presented by the Inuit Circumpolar Council in Shilawatt Cloutier to remind delegates that the health of women and children of the Arctic should be at the forefront of deliberations and global action. And we have now an Indigenous Women's Caucus, particularly active with women of the Arctic, who are present at every conference of the parties. Turning now to a study that was done by IPEN, looking at levels of mercury in hair of over 1,000 women of childbearing age from 25 countries who participated in the study. And some of the highlights of the study were that at least 42% of the women had mercury levels greater than 1 part per million. And that is the level that is the EPA reference dose or level of concern. And 55% of the women who participated had levels greater than 0.58 levels, concentration of mercury, which is a more recent science-based threshold based on data indicating harmful effects at lower levels of exposure. So this study really highlighted the fact that mercury is certainly a global threat to women and developing children. This is a quote from one of my colleagues who's a community health researcher on St. Lawrence Island. She participated in the study. Her levels were elevated, and she's calling for global action at the Minamata Convention. This work on environmental violence was led by the International Indian Treaty Council and Alaska Community Action on Toxics, and many others contributed to this, to have environmental violence recognized as an issue at the United Nations level. And this quote is from a report of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, a report combating violence against indigenous women and girls. And I think this is the foundation of some very important work recognizing chemicals as a form of environmental violence against women and children. And on the right, you see an international symposium and the link there held at Columbia University on the topic of environmental violence. Now back to Alaska. This is a leadership training. We conduct regular leadership trainings with women to give them the tools and the power that they need to change policies and actions at local levels as well as state, national, and international levels. So this is a quote I won't read from one of the women participating in one of our trainings, but these are meant to be both empowering and also to help build collective power to change things in a positive way. This is our colleague Vaiwahi and IPEN representatives standing in solidarity with her, acknowledging at the Stockholm Convention that the chemicals present in our bodies are passed on to our Indigenous children and harm their ability to learn our languages, songs, stories, and knowledge. And Vi hails from St. Lawrence Island, an Arctic community here off the coast of Alaska. And I'll end very briefly, and I won't read these, but these are some quotes of inspiration from women writers and poets, and also acknowledging in the lower right-hand corner, Annie Aloa, who also reminds us every day with her words, "I will fight until I melt." And I think it's standing in solidarity with both women and men to change things for the positive, to protect the most vulnerable. And the quote from Diane de Prima here, "Be strong. We have the right to make the universe we dream." So it's not only about ending harmful practices and phasing out chemicals that are harmful to us, but dreaming a world where everybody has the right to live in a healthy environment. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Pamela. That was really, really inspiring. And I think, starting off sharing your personal experience and what's motivated you to be working on this issue, and then how the Indigenous, the Indigenous communities and their anecdotes, I think that really gives us lots of food for thought. And again, really mentioning that how monitoring and information gathering at local, national level can actually help decision making at global level as well. So thank you a lot for that. I will now, I think let's keep in mind the time so that we can also give our participants an opportunity to ask some questions. I pass now the floor to Vivianetta. Vivian, welcome.
Okay, sorry for the inconveniences. I'm happy to be part of this webinar. It's a great opportunity, and I welcome everyone. And thank you for listening to my own speech. Salut à tout le monde. Permettez-moi tout d'abord de vous souhaiter une bonne année et de me présenter. Je suis Viviane Atta, chargée de programme pour les questions de genre au CREP. À ce titre, mon travail consiste à plaider en faveur d'une plus grande attention aux perspectives de genre et à leur intégration dans les activités de sécurité chimique entreprises par le CREP, en partant du principe que les femmes et les enfants sont affectés de manière disproportionnée par l'exposition aux produits chimiques. Il se trouve que je suis également enseignante de profession. Nous sommes basés au Cameroun et le CREP est actif depuis 2004, consacrant notre travail à combler l'écart entre la science et l'action en vue du développement durable au Cameroun et en Afrique subsaharienne. Nos activités principales consistent à travailler en collaboration avec toutes les parties prenantes sur les questions de santé et d'environnement. Depuis 2012, j'ai contribué a intégré la dimension et le genre dans plusieurs projets et campagnes menées par le CREP, notamment sur les produits chimiques dans les cosmétiques, le plomb dans les peintures, les amalgames dentaires, les pesticides obsolètes, etc. Tiffany, next. Les femmes et les mères comme moi s'efforcent de sensibiliser au niveau local, national et international aux dangers liés aux pesticides extrêmement dangereux, afin de protéger l'environnement et la génération future des pesticides dangereux. Ma motivation personnelle sur cette question vient d'une expérience triste et déchirante dont j'ai été témoin en 2018, lorsque deux frères, âgés de 4 et 2 ans, ont ingéré des pesticides. Ces deux enfants avaient été laissés à la maison par leurs parents et le plus jeune a ramassé un emballage vide de pesticides qui avait été utilisé par leurs parents dans leur champ qui se trouvait près de leur maison. Il a commencé à lécher ce sachet et a crié à son frère qu'il avait trouvé son bonbon. L'autre frère est venu et tous deux ont commencé à lécher le sachet vide de pesticides. Quelques minutes plus tard, les deux enfants ont commencé à vomir et à avoir la diarrhée. Ils ont été amenés dans un centre de santé et avant 3 heures de temps, ils étaient tous morts. Je me suis sentie si mal en tant que femme et en tant que mère. Ce qui m'a rendue encore plus triste, c'est que les membres de leur famille ont commencé à accuser leurs voisins d'être responsables de cette tragédie. Un an après ce triste incident, c'est-à-dire en 2019, j'ai perdu ma belle tante suite à l'exposition à une forte concentration de pesticides. Elle était agricultrice à Bafoussam et possédait des hectares de terre sur lesquels elle cultivait diverses cultures. Bien qu'elle employait des ouvriers pour l'aider, elle était également très impliquée dans les activités agricoles. Elle utilisait constamment des pesticides dans ses champs, sans porter un équipement de protection individuelle, tout comme ses ouvriers et ouvrières. Elle a commencé à se plaindre qu'elle avait mal au nez, mais a pris cela à la légère. Un jour, alors qu'elle était au champ avec ses enfants, le sang a commencé à couler de ses narines. C'est à ce moment-là que la famille a été informée qu'elle était malade. Les médecins lui ont diagnostiqué plus tard un cancer du nez. Et malgré les soins médicaux qu'elle a reçus par la suite, elle est décédée 6 mois plus tard après avoir souffert de graves douleurs. Là encore, ce décès a été attribué à des individus et non à des pesticides susceptibles d'être des pesticides extrêmement dangereux. Ces deux expériences et bien d'autres ont éveillé ma curiosité au sujet des produits chimiques en général et des pesticides en particulier. J'ai compris par la suite qu'au motif d'assurer la sécurité alimentaire dans un monde qui connaît une croissance démographique galopante sans précédent ces dernières années, l'industrie agrochimique promeut à grand coût publicitaire l'utilisation des pesticides chimiques comme panacée. Elle nie ou ignore la science et les preuves, montrant que l'utilisation irrationnelle des pesticides, en particulier des pesticides extrêmement dangereux dans les pays en développement et en transition, cause des dommages sanitaires et environnementaux qui n'ont pas été pleinement évalués. Toutes ces expériences m'ont motivé à créer un cours sur les pesticides extrêmement dangereux. Permettez-moi de remercier une fois de plus l'IPEN et le CREP pour leur encouragement et leur soutien technique qui m'ont permis de le réaliser. Passons maintenant aux statistiques. Tiffany, next. Selon les statistiques, dans le monde, il y a plus de 3 millions de personnes intoxiquées par des pesticides chaque année et entre 20 000 et 200 000 décès sont enregistrés par an, principalement dans les pays en développement. Et tous ces décès sont causés par les pesticides extrêmement dangereux. Environ un tiers des pesticides utilisés dans les pays en développement ne respectent pas les normes de qualité internationales. Il serait étonnant d'entendre que 12 des 20 pesticides vendus dans le monde sont des pesticides extrêmement dangereux. En l'occurrence, le glyphosate, qui est un pesticide qui est largement utilisé dans nos pays, Excusez-moi, s'il vous plaît. 3/4 des pesticides synthétiques identifiés ne sont plus commercialisés dans l'Union européenne à raison d'une réglementation protectrice depuis 1990. La proportion des pesticides synthétiques qu'on trouve dans les pays qui sont importés en Afrique varie entre 4 en Zambie à 67% en Burundi et à 9,5% au Cameroun, selon une étude menée dans 10 pays par IPEN. La participation des femmes à la prise de décision sur l'homologation des pesticides en Afrique est insignifiante et inexistante dans certains pays africains, dont le Cameroun. Actuellement, le Cameroun et de nombreux autres pays en Afrique et dans le monde s'efforcent d'élaborer leur liste nationale de pesticides extrêmement dangereux en se basant sur les critères de la FAO et d'autres, comme ceux de PAN international, suite à la résolution de la SAICM soutenue par la FAO. Tiffany Next. Comme solution à la situation désastreuse vécue dans nos régions, j'ai créé un cours de formation pour donner aux parents et aux personnes en charge des enfants des informations sur les pesticides extrêmement dangereux. Mon objectif est d'aider les gens à connaître et à éviter les pesticides extrêmement dangereux afin de protéger leur santé et l'environnement, de permettre aux décideurs d'être plus vigilants sur la qualité des pesticides homologués dans nos pays et d'encourager l'intégration de l'aspect genre, en particulier les femmes, dans les organes de décision concernant les pesticides en Afrique. J'ai mené des campagnes de sensibilisation dans ma communauté auprès des femmes et des jeunes en particulier sur les dangers liés aux pesticides. Dans ce cadre, j'ai eu à rencontrer des associations des femmes comme l'association Boduma Women de Yaoundé. Je me concentre également sur l'objectif de développement durable, à savoir l'objectif numéro 5, sur l'égalité des sexes, car je travaille pour le soutien des femmes dans le leadership et la prise des décisions afin qu'elles s'engagent sur les questions liées aux produits chimiques en général et aux pesticides en particulier. Dans le cadre des activités de sensibilisation de mon cours, j'ai rencontré des élèves du lycée bilingue de Toupé à Yaoundé et de Frankie Comprehensive Secondary School. Les élèves ont suivi ce cours et ont été invités à compléter leur certificat de fin de formation qui sera considéré dans le cadre de l'un de leurs modules d'apprentissage intitulé « Environnement et santé » et l'enseignement à distance promu par notre gouvernement. Chaque fois que l'occasion se présente, je ne cesse de parler aux femmes et aux jeunes enfants des produits chimiques toxiques. J'ai eu l'occasion de poser la question suivante à un groupe de femmes. Si vous posez un thermomètre à mercure et un verre vide sur votre table et que vous vous rendez compte plus tard que la table perd son équilibre, c'est-à-dire qu'elle est sur le point de se renverser, lequel de ces objets préférez-vous protéger de la casse? La réponse que j'ai reçue de ces femmes m'ont amené à être convaincue que, quel que soit leur niveau d'éducation, de nombreuses femmes vivant dans notre communauté ne sont pas conscientes des dangers liés aux produits chimiques qu'elles utilisent au quotidien. Je saisis la moindre occasion pour leur parler des produits chimiques en général et des pesticides extrêmement dangereux, ainsi que de leur vulnérabilité particulière et de celle de leurs enfants, avec la conviction que les actions individuelles commencent par une bonne formation fournie par des personnes en qui elles ont une grande confiance. Comme vous le savez, les pesticides extrêmement dangereux sont des bombes sanitaires à retardement, ayant des impacts négatifs disproportionnés sur les femmes et les enfants. Nous devons tous, chacun à son niveau, adopter certaines attitudes et certains comportements afin de réduire et, en fin de compte, minimiser notre risque d'exposition, celui de nos enfants et des membres de nos familles aux produits chimiques et aux pesticides extrêmement dangereux. Merci beaucoup pour votre aimable attention. Oui, je vous invite vivement à suivre ce cours en utilisant le lien qui a été proposé par le lien qui est sur l'écran. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Viviane. So Viviane will be posting the link to the course that she mentioned. I see also in the chat box is busy with all the presenters and colleagues from IPEN posting various resources, stories, videos. I also saw one. So please have a look, and as I mentioned earlier, that the chat box will be included as part of the package in the summary that will be sent to you after the webinar. I also encourage participants, if you have any questions throughout the presentation or through the presentation that we'll listen to next, please do post it so that then once the presentations are complete by our panelists, then we can field some questions. So now I would like to give the floor to our two colleagues from Tala Ecologistas. So sorry, it's a little bit of a tongue twister for me for some reason. So Cecilia and Ariana, you have the floor. Thank you, Viviane.
Hola, muchas gracias, Nalini. Buen día a todos y todas. Soy Cecilia Bianco, de Taller Ecologista. Yo quería contarles un poco acerca de la historia de Taller Ecologista. Es una ONG fundada en 1985, un año después de la recuperación de la democracia en el país. En 1976, las Fuerzas Armadas tomaron el gobierno y allí surgieron mujeres con mucho coraje, que son las madres y abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, que son una inspiración para nosotras. Ellas pedían y piden por la aparición de sus hijos e hijas, nietos y nietas, que fueron desaparecidos durante la dictadura militar. Como vemos en la imagen, gracias a ellas, hoy las mujeres también luchamos por otros derechos humanos, como por ejemplo al acceso a un ambiente sano. Los temas ambientales están todos interconectados, entonces para profundizar mejor en cada uno, estamos organizados actualmente en 7 áreas. Este curso se llevó adelante con la participación de las áreas de ecofeminismo, educación socioambiental y tóxicos. El área ecofeminismo es el área más nueva y ha dado una gran motivación a la organización por su lucha por los derechos de las mujeres e identidades feminizadas. Aquí está una de sus integrantes, Ariana. Sofía Naranjo y Juliana Martín también participaron de la realización del curso por esta área. El área de coeducación está coordinada por Claudia Kostinowski, experta en ciencias de la educación, y para nosotros es un honor que sea una de las fundadoras de Taller Ecologista y actualmente presidente de la organización. El área tóxicos tiene sus años y se reafirmó con la difusión del Convenio de Estocolmo en Argentina. Yo, Cecilia Bianco y otros 3 compañeros más integran el área. El curso fue una experiencia maravillosa y un gran aprendizaje. Creíamos que iba a ser más fácil, pero tomar las ideas más importantes de los textos y desarrollar los conceptos en un formato audiovisual fue todo un desafío. También lo fue encontrar investigaciones sobre los impactos de las sustancias químicas en mujeres de la región. Finalmente, puedo decir que crecimos como organización al haber realizado este curso, así que le agradecemos al Caucus de Mujeres de IPEN. Ahora vamos a escuchar a mi compañera Ariana.
Salud, hello everyone. Hola, yo soy Ariana Ortega y como comentó Cecilia, Taller Ecologista es una organización socioambiental sin fines de lucro con más de 36 años de trayectoria radicada en Rosario, Argentina. Trabajamos desde una perspectiva socioambiental y de derechos humanos, entendiendo que uno de ellos es el acceso al ambiente sano. Para nosotros, la vida humana es parte de la vida del resto del planeta y no posee una jerarquía superior. Esto supone reconocernos como seres ecodependientes e interdependientes. En Taller Ecologista consideramos que la vida humana hay que comprenderla como parte de las estructuras sociales y de la biosfera donde se desarrolla. Esta perspectiva nos vuelve conscientes sobre la vulnerabilidad de la vida y nos obliga a hacer foco en la prevención de los impactos ambientales y sociales que la actividad humana puede ocasionar. Y en este marco, ¿qué es lo que pasa con las mujeres? Para nosotros, el vínculo entre género y ambiente es muy fácil de identificar, porque en Latinoamérica son especialmente relevantes las prácticas de las mujeres en defensa de sus territorios, impactadas por la crisis socioecológica global que se manifiesta localmente. Nos organizamos en multisectoriales, asambleas y cooperativas, porque somos las primeras en encender la alarma sobre los efectos de las sustancias tóxicas en la salud y en el ambiente. Esto se debe a que por los roles sociales que desempeñamos solemos estar a cargo del cuidado de nuestras familias, de las actividades reproductivas y de los cuidados comunitarios. Y es por la resistencia de las mujeres en defensa del territorio y la vida que muchas han sido criminalizadas y amenazadas. En América Latina son las lideresas ambientales quienes padecen la cara más visible de la violencia ambiental. En el curso que armamos, como contó Cecilia, gracias a la iniciativa de IPEN, hemos buscado distintos objetivos. En primer lugar, buscamos sensibilizar a las poblaciones sobre la violencia ambiental, que mencionaron también anteriormente, y el impacto de las sustancias químicas tóxicas en los territorios. Para ello hemos elegido dos grupos de sustancias. Uno de estos es el de los plaguicidas altamente peligrosos y el otro de los contaminantes orgánicos persistentes, que también los mencionaron en las presentaciones anteriores. Por otro lado, otro objetivo que perseguimos fue introducir la importancia del principio precautorio, que nos advierte sobre los riesgos de la incertidumbre y nos guía hacia estrategias tendientes a evitar los impactos socioambientales. Por último, hemos buscado incorporar la mirada de género, utilizando también un lenguaje más accesible, que es lo que mencionaban cuando empezamos con el webinar, debido a que los tópicos como tóxicos, economía o energía son considerados excesivamente técnicos y muchas veces quedan fuera del debate las personas que no son especialistas, en especial las mujeres. Como decíamos, consideramos que las mujeres debemos estar representadas. Sin embargo, entendemos que la presencia de mujeres es una condición necesaria para alcanzar los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible, pero no es suficiente, ya que la importancia radica en la mirada que tengamos, en la mirada de género, que es lo que también se estuvo conversando más temprano. Respecto al lenguaje más accesible, hemos tratado de utilizar algunos refranes populares durante el curso, para alcanzar una mayor audiencia, como por ejemplo, en español decimos, es mejor prevenir que curar, cuya versión en inglés es An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Continúa Cecilia.
En el curso hemos explicado las características de estas sustancias, alertando su cercanía con nosotros, nosotras, debido a que las encontramos en nuestro plato de comida, en el suelo, en el aire, tanto en zonas urbanas como rurales. consideramos que el primer paso es informar con datos de la realidad y capacitar sobre las sustancias que representan un alto riesgo para la salud y el ambiente, debido a que son consideradas inocuas por una amplia franja de la población, situación que no es para nada casual. Por esto, el segundo paso es elevar la alerta sobre el uso de estos químicos que ingresan a nuestros cuerpos sin nuestro conocimiento ni consentimiento. Esto nos ayuda a exigir el registro de la información, es decir, solicitar que se realicen estudios epidemiológicos perfectamente diferenciados por género, cuyos resultados deben ser divulgados públicamente. También vemos muy útil contar con herramientas del derecho internacional, como por ejemplo los acuerdos y tratados internacionales, las recomendaciones de organismos internacionales e informes como Mujeres, Productos Químicos y los Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible, creado entre el PNUMA y IPEN, para tomarlos de referencia y para que las poblaciones se movilicen y, de ser posible, generen cambios de abajo hacia arriba. Por ejemplo, que insistan en la implementación a nivel nacional y subnacional del principio precautorio, que se genere legislación que limite o prohíba definitivamente el uso de las sustancias que generan daño a la salud y aparte que no se permite el doble estándar, como es el caso de sustancias que están prohibidas en algunos países y en otros tienen un uso que está permitido. Se trata de temas comunes y frecuentes para la mujer latinoamericana, por lo que creemos que será de interés para las organizaciones y ciudadanas de otros países de la región. Agradecemos el aval del Programa de Naciones Unidas para el Medio Ambiente y la oportunidad de participar en este webinar. Queremos un país, una región, un mundo libre de tóxicos y tenemos el convencimiento de que las mujeres son fundamentales, esenciales para cumplir con este objetivo. Sabemos que los cursos de IPEN sobre género son un gran aporte al respecto. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Okay, let's just give our interpreter maybe a minute. Looks like he had something in his throat. Sorry about that, Cecilia and Ariana. Are you back? Okay, perfect. So let's continue. Thanks.
Sorry, we finished our presentation. I don't know if... Okay.
Sorry.
We were continuing and then we had a little break because our interpreter, who was interpreting in English, thank you so much, Cecilia and Ariana, for that really interesting presentation. And, you know, again, just speaking around, again, the same message coming through, right? That information and awareness raising really helps to make informed decision making. So how key it is that we do make sure that data, information sharing takes place at all levels. Great. Okay, well, so thank you very much to all the panelists for their great presentations. Why don't we now move to the Q&A session? And we have some interesting topics that are coming up, some questions are coming up. Perhaps I can start with one of the questions to Monika. Monika, there is a question around, in the report, the part on electronic and electrical products, that the EU has banned the export of electronic waste to developing countries. So, and the gentleman who, I don't know actually the name of the person who posed the question, it was just sent to me by one of the facilitators, but they feel that this is excellent news. Along the same lines, the export of chemical products are also prohibited in the EU, but they are produced in the EU and exported to developing countries such as in Latin America. So what given, you know, that we have already experiences about electronic and electrical waste, I mean, how does that, how can that be translated also to chemical products?
Thanks for that question, and thanks, Nalini, for that. UNEP currently is working on a number of issues to identify and to help work with our MEA colleagues, particularly in the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm conventions, who do have purview over the global movement of toxic elements, chemicals, and waste, to find ways that we can, in fact, help strengthen the member states' legislative capacities to avoid these kinds of inappropriate transfer of chemicals and waste from anywhere in the globe to somewhere else and leave it as a burden to other countries. And so this is where we are working hand in hand with the MEAs. Most of our work is around providing the necessary evidence, the scientific basis upon which to do that, and through our governance work to support governments in introducing the necessary legislation and the necessary regulations to ensure that it is not accepted within countries on the receiving end. So that is work that is ongoing in a number of fronts across UNEP and including with the MEAs. And I think we can follow this up with greater detail. But I know that we're running a little bit short on time. So I hope that information gives them a good place to start and think about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monika. A question for Viviane. You spoke about the poisoning that was taking place from HHPs. What are the alternatives that are available, and if you've been looking at them, and how does green and sustainable chemistry also play a role in the work that you're doing and the information sharing? So I think Viviane, Cecilia, Ariana, if any of you would like to address that. I think similar issues, especially around the pesticides. So, and then finally for Viviane, if you have the floor, another question to you is that you're doing some really important work. It's really, it's sad to hear about children being poisoned, not having the information that they require. What do you need to strengthen your work? So perhaps Viviane, you start, and then we can move to Ariana or Cecilia.
Okay, thank you for giving me the floor once more. I think women should be aware of the dangers related to chemicals, and they should use the agroecology approach in agriculture. I think our government should encourage the population, especially the women, to use the agroecology approach to agriculture. That they should also reduce the importation of toxic chemicals in our country. And they should try to come up with a list of pesticides. Most importantly, women should be informed that they are vulnerable to chemicals and their children. And again, alternatives exist. We should promote the alternative, especially the agroecology approach to farming.
And Viviane, the question also was, what do you need, what support do you require to help strengthen your work?
We need financial support. We need more training. We need, if means were given, we can use different local languages to make the communication go through. Because at this level, I ended my work in Yaoundé, but it was possible for me to go out. If it was possible for me to go to the villages, I would have done so. Because at least I can speak like 3 or 4 native languages. So by meeting the farmer themselves, talking to them about this danger that they are facing related to the chemical they are using the local language, and being a woman, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Viviane. Ariana, Cecilia, would you like to add around alternatives to pesticides?
Yes. Sí, coincido con que hay que fortalecer todas las producciones agroecológicas. En Argentina hay un gran avance en este tema, pero todavía, por supuesto, no es suficiente. Y también hay que decir que analizamos todo el ciclo de vida. En este caso hablamos de los plaguicidas, y ellos hacen daño en todas sus etapas. Y en Argentina hay estudios que demuestran la contaminación en ríos, en suelos, en caminos rurales, con diferentes plaguicidas. Entonces, De ahí la importancia, como dijo Vivian, reitero, y apoyamos también todas las ONGs que trabajan en el tema de agroecología, de que tiene que ser esa nuestra bandera, esa forma, nuestros alimentos tienen que venir sin agrotóxicos.
Perdón, me gustaría también agregar algo más. Es muy importante que se puedan realizar estudios independientes de los laboratorios, y en ese sentido coincido con lo que dijo Vivian sobre el financiamiento a investigadores e investigadoras que puedan avanzar en investigaciones que vayan más allá del indicador que se utiliza actualmente por la industria en Argentina, que es la dosis letal mínima. En ese sentido, necesitamos tener investigaciones que puedan ser utilizables para la población, para que nos podamos informar sobre las consecuencias diferenciadas, no solo en hombres y en mujeres, sino en distintos grupos etarios, pero que sepamos cuáles son las consecuencias que tiene la utilización de los distintos productos. Y eso no es algo que tengamos muy a mano, o sea, fue difícil conseguir la información para el curso, y en este momento hay un debate muy importante en Argentina respecto a este tema, por lo cual sería muy útil para nosotros tener estudios confiables y revisados por pares evaluadores.
And Ariane, perhaps, well, there's another question about what specifically is the role of women in the elimination of these alternatives for the use of HHPs? So, you know, yes, we can talk about the solutions that exist, but then in terms of the role of the women in order to push it, to take to be in charge of it, perhaps, I don't know, like, I don't know if some of your studies or research on the ground work has touched upon this.
It's for us, the question?
Well, I think Vivian,
yeah,
and you, and yeah, so, but, okay, so Vivian, I don't know if you would like
yes,
me to, please
yes,
go ahead. I think this is interactive, and then sometimes also we share across regions, you know, lots of information. This is the whole
Sí,
thing.
me gustaría.
Go ahead, Cecilia.
Sí, me gustaría compartir que hay estudios de investigadoras en el país Uruguay, vecino Argentina, también en Chile, en Brasil, mujeres que hablan acerca de, bueno, cuánto impacto generan los plaguicidas. Y respecto de los altamente peligrosos, bueno, también hay informes, pero también tenemos que decir que no están diferenciados los efectos en las mujeres y en los varones, ¿sí? En las mujeres, en lo que se refiere a la participación para luchar en contra de los plaguicidas, están muy presentes. Recientemente he visto que han realizado un mapa interactivo en donde están todos los conflictos relacionados a los plaguicidas y a otro tipo de actividades. Pero la mujer en Argentina está muy presente. Ustedes vieron la primera imagen nuestra que hablaba acerca de mujeres movilizadas en una ciudad específica del centro del país, y ellas hicieron un trabajo enorme en contra de los plaguicidas, y aún lo siguen sosteniendo porque el tema en la justicia, en la parte judicial, es muy lento, pero siguen allí.
Thank you for that, Cecilia. Vivian, would you like to add in terms of the role of women in finding alternatives to HHPs?
I'd just like to say about women should be more informed about the dangers related to HHP. And the challenge in education is that many women in our communities are not educated. So we need to use the local language in order to get them informed. So the main challenge is to educate our population. That's our main challenge, to educate our population. Because if everyone is well informed, if everyone is educated, we can help reduce the exposure to HHPs. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivian. So I think with that, we're coming to the top of, to the end of our webinar today. I'd like to thank everybody for joining, the participants. I saw quickly through the participants list, we had people from the Asia Pacific region, Europe, Africa, Latin America. So a really great audience today, listening to some very nice presentations that we received, the keynote speech from Per, and then our panelists sharing their information, whether at global level or at local level, and also learning about Indigenous communities. So unfortunately, Pamela had to leave us, but please thank her very much for her presentation, Tiffany. And I wish you all a nice afternoon or evening or night. I think some of you this is quite late at night for you. So thank you very much for participating. Bye-bye.